She didn't leave because you weren't enough. She left because her emotions changed. Most people think rejection is a final decision, like a logical conclusion written in stone. But in reality, rejection is almost never logical. It's emotional. It's based on how someone feels in a specific moment, not on your true value or potential or what the relationship could become over time. Feelings fluctuate, they rise, they fall, they get influenced by stress, fear, past experiences, outside opinions, and even boredom. So when she rejects you, what she's really rejecting is a version of you filtered through her emotional state at that time. This is why trying to argue against rejection never works. You can't negotiate emotions with logic. You can't convince someone to feel something they're not feeling. You can show effort, consistency, loyalty, and intentions, but if her emotional connection dips, none of that matters in that moment. She might even say things that sound definitive, like, I'm not ready, I don't feel the spark, or you deserve better. But those are emotional explanations, not permanent truths. And here's where most people make the biggest mistake. They take rejection personally. They assume it means they are not attractive enough, not interesting enough, not successful enough, not valuable enough. So they start chasing, over explaining, proving, upgrading themselves just to be chosen. But the truth is, rejection doesn't measure your worth. It only reflects her internal emotional alignment at that time. What changes everything is understanding that emotions are dynamic, they're influenced by environment, comparison, and especially absence. When you were present, available, predictable, and emotionally invested, she experienced you as part of her emotional routine. And humans adapt quickly to routines. We stop feeling intensity around what feels familiar, even if it's good. So the emotional response fades, not because the value disappeared, but because the stimulus became normal. That's why rejection often turns into curiosity later, not because you changed overnight, but because her emotional context changed. Once you step back, stop chasing, and remove your emotional presence, the dynamic shifts. The same person she rejected now exists in a different psychological frame. You're no longer the constant, you're the absence. And absence triggers different emotions than presence ever could. She starts remembering you differently, not through the lens of daily interaction, but through memory, imagination, and contrast. And memory amplifies emotion. It filters out the mundane and highlights the emotional peaks. So suddenly, what she once felt neutral about starts feeling meaningful. What she once overlooked starts feeling rare. This is why she comes back. Not because you convinced her, not because you proved anything, but because her emotional state evolved. The rejection was never about your permanent value. It was about a temporary emotional disconnection. And once you understand that, you stop chasing people who reject you and you let time, distance, and self respect do the work for you. When you walk away after being rejected, something subtle but powerful happens in the other person's mind. At first, it feels like nothing. It feels like the story is over, like a door closed and life moved on. But psychologically, the opposite is happening. Your absence creates contrast, and contrast is the foundation of perception. We don't feel the value of things while they're constantly present. We feel their value when they're gone. While you were there, available, emotionally invested, and consistent, your presence became part of her emotional environment. It became normal, not unappreciated, just familiar. And the human brain is wired to adapt to familiarity. It stops reacting strongly to what it sees every day, even if it's good. This is why people lose excitement in routines, relationships, and even dreams. Not because they're bad, but because the emotional system got used to them. But when you disappear, the emotional environment changes. The brain notices the difference immediately. The same energy that felt ordinary now feels missing. And that missing feeling creates a psychological vacuum. The mind hates gaps, it wants to fill them with meaning. So it starts replaying memories, reinterpreting past interactions, and comparing the present emotional state with the past one. This is where contrast becomes powerful. She begins to feel the difference between life with you and life without you. The conversations that stopped, the attention that disappeared, the emotional safety that quietly faded, and what felt normal before now feels rare. What felt predictable now feels uncertain, and uncertainty intensifies emotional awareness. This is also where imagination takes over reality. When you were present, she experienced you as you were, but when you're absent, she experiences you through memory and projection. And memory is selective. It doesn't replay every detail, it amplifies emotional highlights and softens the flaws. So the version you in her mind slowly becomes more attractive than the version that existed in real time, not because you changed, but because the psychological frame changed. You moved from being a constant to being a contrast, from being accessible to being distant, from being emotionally available to being unknown, and the unknown always feels more intriguing than the known. This is why chasing never works after rejection. Chasing kills contrast. It keeps you present in a way that feels familiar and predictable. It removes the emotional gap that could have created reflection. Instead of missing you, she just experiences you as pressure, noise, or emotional weight. Walking away calmly is the opposite. It doesn't try to influence, it allows the mind to process loss naturally. And loss is what activates value recognition, not logic, not arguments, not effort, absence. And the irony is, you don't even need to do anything. The contrast works on its own. Time, distance, and silence create the emotional shift. You simply stop interfering with the psychological process. That's why so many people come back after rejecting someone, not because the person chased harder, but because they stopped showing up. Because once you're gone, you're finally felt. At some point, the contrast turns into realization, and realization is often delayed, not because people are blind, but because value is hardest to see when it's freely available. When someone knows they can access you anytime, emotionally or physically, the brain categorizes you as safe and guaranteed. And while that sounds positive psychologically, it reduces urgency, curiosity, and emotional intensity. This is where the biggest shift happens. When you're no longer there, when you're no longer reaching out, when you're no longer emotionally accessible, the brain can no longer label you as guaranteed. The emotional safety net disappears. And once something is no longer guaranteed, the mind starts re-evaluating its importance. She begins to reflect not on what you lacked, but on what you gave, the support, the attention, the consistency, the way you showed up. All the things that were invisible when they were constant suddenly become noticeable when they're gone. And this is the moment most people misinterpret as she suddenly realized your worth. But it's not sudden, it's delayed awareness. Human beings often don't recognize value in real time. We recognize it in retrospect. We understand how important something was only after it's no longer accessible. And that's because experience is noisy. It's filled with distractions, emotions, options, and external influences. But absence is quiet, and in that quiet, memory becomes clearer. This is also why people regret more than they appreciate. Regret is emotional clarity after loss. Appreciation requires awareness during presence, and most people don't have that level of emotional awareness. They only understand through contrast, distance, and time. So when she comes back, she's not responding to who you were at the end. She's responding to who you were across the entire connection. The full emotional picture finally comes into focus. The things she took for granted are now framed as rare. The attention she assumed would always be there now feels valuable. The emotional security she didn't consciously notice now feels like something missing. And here's the key part: this realization doesn't happen because you explained your value. It happens because you stopped offering it for free. You didn't advertise yourself, you withdrew access. And that forced her emotional system to update its perception. This is why trying to prove your worth is always counterproductive. Value that needs to be explained loses power. Real value is felt, not argued. It's experienced through absence, not persuasion. And once someone realizes your value too late, the dynamic flips. You're no longer trying to be seen, you're being remembered. You're no longer chasing appreciation, you're receiving recognition after detachment. But by the time that recognition arrives, something in you has already changed. You're no longer emotionally invested in the outcome. You're no longer waiting for validation. You've already moved from seeking to selecting. So when she returns, she's not meeting the same version of you. She's meeting someone who learned their worth without needing her approval. And that's why the comeback never feels the same as the beginning. Something else quietly happens during this whole process, and it's one of the most misunderstood parts of attraction. While she is going through emotional shifts, reflection, and delayed realization, you are changing in a completely different way, not externally, not on social media, not through some performance, but internally. And that internal shift is what actually makes you more attractive without you even trying. When you stop chasing after rejection, you stop leaking energy, you stop investing emotional effort into someone who is unsure about you, you stop trying to fix, convince, impress, or prove. And all of that energy that used to flow outward now comes back inward into your goals. your body, your mindset, your direction, your standards. This is the moment you move from neediness to self-containment. Before, your emotional state was partially dependent on her responses. A message could lift your mood, a delay could ruin your day. You were emotionally reactive, not weak, just attached. But once you step back, you start stabilizing internally. Your mood becomes less dependent on external validation. Your confidence becomes quieter, deeper, less performative. And that shift is extremely rare. Most people never reach it. Most people stay stuck in emotional loops, repeating the same patterns with different people. But when you truly detach, you start operating from a different frequency. You're no longer seeking approval, you're embodying self respect. You're no longer chasing attraction, you're becoming grounded. This is where attraction changes at a fundamental level, not attraction based on words flirting or effort, but attraction based on presence, emotional stability, calmness, non reactivity, the kind of energy that doesn't beg to be chosen but doesn't fear being lost either. Ironically, this is often the exact moment she feels the shift, not because you posted something, not because you sent signals, but because your energy is no longer reaching for her. And people feel that, even unconsciously. They feel when someone is no longer emotionally available in the same way. They feel when the attachment cord has been cut. And that's what makes it powerful. You're not trying to be attractive, you're no longer trying at all. You're focused on your life, your growth, your purpose. You're no longer centered around her emotional world. You've returned to your own. This is also where your standards rise. You start seeing things you ignored before, mixed signals, inconsistency, emotional imbalance. You stop romanticizing potential and start valuing reality. You stop chasing what could be and start respecting what is. And once that happens, you become selective. And selectiveness is magnetic, not because it's a strategy, but because it's rooted in self worth. You're no longer available to anyone who shows mild interest. You're no longer trying to earn connection. You're evaluating alignment. So when she comes back, she's not coming back to the same emotional position. She's approaching someone who has shifted internally, someone calmer, stronger, less attached, more grounded. And that difference is felt immediately. You didn't become more attractive by doing more. You became more attractive by needing less. And that's the shift that changes everything. There's another force working in the background when someone rejects you and then later comes back, and it's one most people underestimate: the power of unfinished emotional loops. The human mind hates incomplete stories. It hates unresolved connections, unanswered questions, and emotional threads that feel cut off without a proper ending. And when you disappear without drama, without begging, without closure, you leave behind exactly that: an open loop. At first, she feels relief. The tension is gone, the pressure is gone, the situation feels handled. But over time, something strange happens. The mind starts revisiting the experience, not because it wants to, but because it needs resolution. And since there was no emotional conclusion, the brain keeps replaying the same moments, trying to make sense of them. This is why people think about exes years later, not always because they want them back, but because the story never felt complete. There was no clear emotional ending, no final understanding, just silence and distance. And silence is the most powerful form of ambiguity. It gives the mind infinite space to project meaning. So she starts asking herself questions. What really happened? Did I make the right choice? Why didn't he fight for me? Why did he disappear so easily? Did I matter less than I thought? And these questions are dangerous because they shift the emotional narrative. Instead of you being the one rejected, you become the one who walked away. And this is where the dynamic flips internally. The mind starts reframing the story. Instead of I rejected him, it becomes I lost him. Instead of he wanted me, it becomes he stopped wanting me. And that subtle shift creates a completely different emotional experience. Unfinished loops also create idealization. When something ends without closure, the brain fills in the gaps with imagination. It starts focusing on emotional highlights and minimizing the negatives. The arguments fade, the flaws soften, the emotional peaks become the main memory. And suddenly the connection feels more meaningful in retrospect than it did in real time. This is why absence combined with silence is so powerful. You didn't just leave physically, you left psychologically unresolved. You didn't give her a clean emotional ending. You didn't collapse into desperation. You didn't seek validation. You just disappeared from the emotional narrative, and the mind can't let that go easily. It's not about manipulation, it's about natural psychology. The brain seeks patterns, meaning, and resolution. When it doesn't get them, It keeps returning to the source. That's why she comes back, not always because she's in love, not always because she wants a relationship, but because the emotional loop is still open. She wants to see who you became. She wants to feel the connection again. She wants to rewrite the ending. She wants to test if the door is still open. But by the time she reaches out, something in you has already closed, not out of bitterness, but out of growth. You no longer need the ending she couldn't give you. You already created your own. And that's when her return stops being about her choice and becomes about yours. The final truth behind why she comes back after rejecting you is the one most people never expect, because it has nothing to do with her and everything to do with you. By the time she returns, the power has already shifted, not on the surface, not in words, but internally. You are no longer standing in the same emotional position you were when she left. At beginning, rejection puts her in control of the narrative. She decides, she leads, she chooses distance, and you're left reacting. But the moment you accept the rejection without chasing, without collapsing, without trying to negotiate your way back into her life, the structure changes. You remove yourself from the role of the one seeking approval. And that's the moment emotional leadership begins. While she is processing, reflecting, and replaying memories, you are detaching. You are building a life that no longer revolves around her emotional decisions. You stop waiting for messages. You stop checking for signs. You stop measuring your worth through her attention. And slowly, almost invisibly, your identity shifts from someone who wants to be chosen to someone who chooses. This is where the real flip happens. When she comes back, she expects the old version of you, the one who is emotionally invested, available, hoping. But what she meets instead is someone calmer, less reactive, less attached to outcomes, someone who doesn't rush to respond, someone who doesn't need reassurance, someone who is no longer emotionally positioned beneath her decision, and that creates a new dynamic instantly. Now is the one reaching out, she is the one testing the connection. She is the one seeking emotional access, and you are the one evaluating, not because you're trying to gain power, because you've already gained clarity. You're no longer asking, why did she reject me? You're asking, does this align with who I am now? That's a completely different level of consciousness. This is why so many reconnections fail, not because there's no attraction, but because the emotional hierarchy changed. The person who returns expects to step back into the old roles, but the person who grew no longer fits them. The emotional contract expired. And here's the deepest part: even if she comes back with interest, curiosity, or regret, you no longer need her return to feel validated. Her attention is no longer the source of your self worth. Her interest is no longer the prize. Your peace is. So the comeback becomes optional instead of necessary. You're not emotionally dependent on the outcome anymore. You can accept it or decline it without losing yourself. And that's real power, not control over her, but control over your emotional direction. This is the ultimate reason she comes back. Not because you waited, not because you proved anything, but because you outgrew the version of yourself that needed her decision to feel complete. And once that happens, even if she returns, she's not reclaiming you. She's meeting someone who already moved on internally.